As usual, the internet was outraged over a Pepsi commercial today, and I'm not going to talk about that controversy, but seeing the ad got me thinking this is a good learning lesson for talking about what makes good looking shots. So we're actually going to go through a couple frames from this Pepsi commercial that has since been pulled from YouTube, but you can still find it if you want to go watch the full thing. I'm not going to show the video because I don't want this video to get flagged or pulled for copyright. We're just going to be looking at still frames, but for our purposes, talking about the cinematography, that is going to be just fine. This is actually a 720 capture, that I downloaded, and now I pulled screenshots, and it's going to be re-uploaded to YouTube. So we're not looking at resolution or compression or anything like that. We're purely looking at the aesthetics of the image, lighting, composition, that kind of cinematography aspect. Most people watch things on their phones nowadays, so really, resolution is a nice thing to kind of the icing on the cake, but really when it comes down to an image, what sets it apart is usually down to the lighting and the composition. So that's what we're going to take a look at today. This is the first frame from the video, and right from the get-go, Pepsi is doing something smart. They're putting their product front and center for like half a second, kind of that subliminal marketing where they show their can. But what's really interesting about this image is that in the highlights you can see here, they're not fully blown out. They actually have that kind of milky gray look to the highlights. The parts that are a little bit brighter, this kind of edge on the can, on the hand here, it's giving that kind of nice wrap and that texture. Anytime you're filming product shots, food shots, close-ups, yeah, pretty much anything in general looks better when you have a nice edge to it. And it's not only an edge because we've got this kind of front fill where the shot is exposed, but if we look at the scopes, you can actually see that it's fairly underexposed. Everything's kind of in the bottom half of this waveform over here. And if you don't know how to read a waveform graph, basically top up here at 100% is pure white, bottom is pure black, left to right is left to right in the frame. You can look up some videos on how to read it in more detail if you really want to know, but basically we're just mapping exposure values left to right across the frame so that we can see this highlight section here is kind of right in here. So where we're not at 100%, we're not clipping with that kind of super bright white, it's actually a little bit kind of in that like 80%, 70% range. Going back in and going to the next shot. I pulled this shot because it was early on in the piece and it's one of the few wide shots, which I'm going to touch on in a little bit, but it's also one of the few aerial shots. I don't know if this was a drone or a helicopter of some kind. I don't know how they did it, but what you can see is that they shot it at, at that golden hour, even kind of past that, depending on what you consider golden hour. We don't have any harsh direct sunlight. It is that dusk twilight maybe where it's still bright out so you can get an exposure, but we've got lights in the city and there's no harsh shadows anywhere. It's basically a full sky of diffusion, but still exposed. So if you ever want to shoot, this is a really nice time to do it because you get nice soft, even lighting, but you can still get your exposure. But they only had a few minutes to get this shot, and there's a couple shots like this in the sequence. But the main thing to take away from this is the wideness of this shot, because that's going to come into play later on. This next shot is one of the few shots in this piece that has kind of a more contrast than a lot of the other stuff. A lot of the other stuff is more commercial, it's more flat. This I thought was kind of interesting just for the drama of it. And if we look at the waveform over here, you can see there's a ton that's in the lower quarter of the waveform here. The only thing that's really standing out is his face, that's usually what you want to draw attention to, is skin, people's faces, people's eyes, so that you know where to look. And what you can see here too, which they do a lot in this piece, which we'll get into, is something that I've talked about in the past, is using, even if it's not technically an edge light, it's still on the far side of the frame, backlighting, however you want to think about it, but the side of his face that's closest to the camera, this side here, is actually what is underexposed, and the key light is coming from that opposite side, the side that's further away from the camera. That makes a little bit more sense once I show you a few more examples of it, but it's something that really helps shape faces, products, any kind of image where you want to show dimension. It's really helpful to put that key kind of on that far side. Next up, we've got this shot. Again, another close-up that we've got focused on the eye here, and we've got that kind of far side lighting where it's kind of, you could think of it as an edge, but it's basically coming from off screen here, wrapping around her face, and the side that's closest to camera is the side that's underexposed or less exposed. And again, looking at the waveform, this happens all the time with kind of modern aesthetics, modern styles, is having that kind of darker exposure. But you'll notice that there's not a lot in the pure black. Even the blacks are kind of like just a touch gray. So you still have the kind of illusion that there's kind of detail there, even though there's not maybe technically detail actually there. And that may be due to compression. Obviously, it's Pepsi, so they're spending a lot of money on this. They're going to be shooting on nicer cameras, but there's still a lot of detail in here, even though it is what some might consider underexposed. I actually think it looks quite nice, and that's something else I've also touched on, is kind of grading your exposure down, pushing it to that lower level so it's not, everything's not super bright and kind of video-y. This next shot I had to point out just because if you're going to do anything with a product, with a logo, if it is meant to be a product video, a shot like this is totally fine. But I think that this commercial has a little bit too much of the Pepsi flavor of Pepsi brand. This shot, they even rack focus to the can, and it's perfectly positioned right on that right third of the frame, and your eye just goes right to it. And it's like, you know, it's a Pepsi ad. I don't think they had to put it this much in everyone's face, but the shot's still a nice shot. Again, we can, if you want to look, we can look at the waveform over here, and so much of it is in that bottom half. There's very, very little getting up close to 100% white, maybe just a touch, like some of these specular highlights on this Pepsi can. But other than that, everything else is what some may consider underexposed, but I think it looks good to me. This is our first hero shot of Kendall. I don't recall if I said Kylie or Kendall before. I get them confused. It doesn't really matter. Point of this shot is we've got that nice, soft kind of key light, maybe just directly above her, maybe a little bit over here, casting the shadows kind of away. So there's a lot of a more flat look. This is kind of the opposite of what I was talking about before. So the light is coming from the side that's closest to the camera. So everything is filled in. Her hair, this is something else that a lot of people may or may not pay attention to when they're filming, but her hair is actually parting away from camera, which is really nice. If the camera had been on the other side, this hair would be getting in her eyes, it would be getting in the way. Right now we've got this nice opening so we can see her face, and it's kind of that hero shot establishing this is kind of our main character for this piece. And then, of course, everyone who knows who she is gonna, you know, maybe keep watching the ad. Other than that, we've got, looking at the waveform here, we've got a little bit more in the brighter realm. That's kind of her face just really standing out, so it pops from the background. But a lot of these, you know, blacks, the shadows, they're really not going, you know, to zero. They're staying low, still moody, but still having detail there. We don't need to full screen that. We want to full screen that. Here's a shot that I pulled out, and this is where you can start to see that even though this is a wide shot, it is not a wide lens. Pay attention to that. I've talked about this in the past as well, and this is a perfect example. This ad is a great example of why you want to shoot with longer focal lengths. Even though this is a wide shot showing a lot of people, it's got a lot more compression. We've still got that kind of background blur, depth of field, bokeh, however you want to think about it. But we're using a slightly longer focal length to get a wide shot, and that almost 99.9% of the time is going to make your shots look better rather than going to a wide angle lens, which wide angle lenses have their place. But if you want your footage, just in general, if you want your footage to look better, using a longer focal length, whether you're doing close-ups, mediums, or wides, the longer focal length will help you get better looking shots. And so you can actually just put a lens on your camera, like anything that's like a 50 and above. I mean, if you're shooting at 70 or 200, like if you're doing wide shots with a 200 millimeter focal length, that'll actually look really, really nice. And I don't know exactly the focal length they're using here, but it is definitely longer because we're just getting so, you know, everything is so compressed. There's so much going on here, so many people, so many signs, and this could very well be, you know, some kind of visual effects composite where they didn't actually have all these people. Again, I don't know how they did it, but the look of it, if you were going to try and do something similar, would be to use a longer focal length. And this is where we start showing kind of the more like realistic, authentic crowd that they're going for. And so you start to see that there are some spots that are blowing out. If we take a look at the waveform, this looks a lot different than some of the more cinematic shots we were looking at before. This is full spectrum, top to bottom, 0 to 100, black to white. We've got everything here, both racially and exposure-wise. We've got everything here. And that's actually a really good thing, I think, in this situation, because they want it to, even though it's an ad and we know it's all staged, we know it's all fake, it's still, these are the shots that lend to it being, more real, more authentic, not as staged. And, maybe it's a technical issue too of getting this many people perfectly exposed the way you want is a much bigger challenge than just exposing Kendall Jenner on a stairway. That's a little bit simpler task. It still takes time, but this many people, you're probably going to have to go for that, more authentic look. But that's where that focal length really helps sell the shot as something that looks better than your typical just wide angle, news documentary camera. This next shot is also really, really interesting. We've got, again, a wider shot with a maybe slightly wider focal length, but it looks a little bit wider here, and we're doing the kind of this cool over the head thing. But what you'll notice is that even though we've got contrast with these highlights and shadows from the people walking, and maybe there's a tree here or something, the actual shadows themselves are not the darkest part of the image. The darkest part of the image is the hair, the jackets, and so there's a lot of contrast, but it's not in the shadows, which is where you might think it might be. If you were to film something and you point a light at anything that casts a shadow, the part that's in the light is going to be very, very bright, and the part that's in the shade or in the shadow is going to be very, very dark, because there's essentially no light hitting it. What you need to do is bring the ambient light level up. So I don't know if this is an actual, if they're really using the sun, if they've got some really high-powered lights out there shooting through some kind of silk or diffusion, and they're doing something to bring the ambient light up. But I just thought it was really interesting that it's not about highlights and shadows in terms of being bright and dark. The shadows and highlights are actually kind of like a mid-tone in this, and the brightest parts are the people with like the white shirts and hats and the signs, and then the darkest parts are the clothes and the hair. I suppose it could be the case that someone went in and painted all the contrast in and tracked it and did some advanced coloring, but I thought this shot was a really nice look at having your shadows actually a little bit brighter than what they might be naturally if you're just filming out in direct sunlight, because direct sunlight is always a challenge, and you're going to get really dark, deep shadows unless you bring them up somehow. This next shot is really important to pay attention to. Again, we've got like a wide shot with a longer or a medium focal length, and this is a very typical shot in terms of a person near a window. So we've got the key light coming in here, the window, filling in the left side of his face here. What makes this shot, in my opinion, is the location, and that's what sells the shot almost all the time. Is if you have a cool location, which I think this is a pretty cool location, lots of texture, really cool colors. It helps that it's blue, matches with Pepsi, I suppose. And we got some contrast here with the cello. Is that a cello? I think so. I don't think it's a bass is the bigger one, and it's definitely not a violin, so I'm going to go with a cello. That's the contrasting color, having orange there. We've got this touch of like the leather couch, and just some detail, but like not too much detail. The location really sells this shot in my mind, and that's the thing. If you can find a really good location, your shots are going to look better. It's just as simple as that. Next shot, I thought the framing on this shot was interesting. It's very quick in the actual edit, but just throwing it in there for a little spice, a little variety, a little unconventional. It is becoming more and more common to do kind of this lower third framing with a lot of empty negative space. Granted, it's not totally empty and negative because we've got a lot of texture here, but this kind of framing is becoming more and more popular. You just don't see it all the time, and although I wouldn't use it as my go-to, to throw it in for variety really helps just kind of make the piece feel more complete. Next shot, we've got this really nice close-up, and here again we've got another good example of that far side key light where the light is wrapping around his face, and we're seeing all this shadow or shade in here, but it's not fully underexposed. It's just got a nice wrap to it, and if the light were on this side closest to the camera, it would be a lot flatter, a lot less interesting, less dramatic, and I just think this works so well. When in doubt, just put a key on that far side, and the light, especially if soft light like this, it just looks so nice. Next up, we got this shot where more Pepsi branding. I'm sorry, I apologize for all the Pepsi in this video. It happens when you're analyzing a Pepsi ad. But what's cool about this shot is even though we've got this background that is significantly brighter than the foreground, we've even got another, this is like the midground, we've got a foreground, so you've got a lot of layers in this shot, and I think that really helps sell it. And even though it's bright back here, it's not overexposed, it's not blown out. If we look at the waveform, we do have it getting up there towards the 100% line, but we still have a good portion of it down here in the lower quadrants where we're looking at it, and it's just that nice. Again, if you were looking at it from that far side key perspective, edge light here, edge here, just kind of popping everything out, making it stand out, making it look more interesting than if the light was coming from the front side and everything was exposed the exact same way. You might look at a shot like this and want them to have the exact same exposure as the people back here, but what I think helps sell this shot is that you understand based on the lighting that they're under some kind of awning, they're in shade, so they're a little bit exposure level wise lower than what's going on here in the background, and it helps make them stand out when everything out here is a little bit brighter and it's not all one uniform exposure. We've got levels, we've got layers of foreground, midground, background, and we've got levels or layers of exposure, which is really nice. Here's that, again, perfect example of that far side edge kind of giving a nice wrap and texture to what's going on here. And of course, we've got more products because it's an ad. Another shot where we've got very flat, even, very soft light. This is not, direct sun. Unless you're out, you get lucky with some really nice cloud cover, you're not going to get exposures like that. And again, we've got that longer focal length where we're getting all this background just blurred out, and we really can just focus in on our subjects. And this is something that, this is maybe like a medium shot where we've got 2, maybe 3 people technically in the, composition here, but it's still that longer lens giving us that nice compression and just a really nice clean look. And again, another good example of that kind of unconventional framing, but we've got a lot of texture. There's so much visual interest here and variety that even though it's out of focus and it's not necessarily the focus of the shot, it still adds a lot of character to the image itself. And here we start to see we've got another very traditional window light as our key, just a nice soft. And this is kind of the key light is now coming from the side closest to the camera, so those shadows are kind of on the opposite side, and we're getting less of that wrap effect, and it's much more flat. But even because we see both sides of the face, we still get the sense of dimension and depth that, half of her face is brighter, and the other half is a little bit darker, giving us that just that nice texture where it's not all one uniform color, where like here it's very flat, which is nice for a commercial, but this definitely has a lot more drama to it. But they flip it for this close-up. She turns to look at the window, if that's her eye line, she turns to look at the window, and now that light is kind of coming from that backside, doing what we were talking about before, where it's wrapping as kind of that far side edge key, whatever you want to call it. And here we have, I got to show the waveform for this because it's just, what a mess. But it's, again, this is the authentic stuff, or the stuff that they're going for, that's, the more realistic stuff. So we've got these really, really bright exposure levels here where it's, essentially blowing out and clipping, and we're not getting detail there. But we still have a lot that's retained. And this is the kind of shot, like, this passes because we're looking at this piece. There's so much variety going on that's kind of visually interesting to kind of insert stuff like this. But if you filmed an entire commercial with this kind of lighting setup where you're blowing out your highlights that much, it really wouldn't look that good. I don't think this shot particularly looks that good, and I think that's kind of the reason. It's just a little bit too bright, a little bit too blown out, and not something I would want to go to as the standard method for filming. Here we have the complete opposite. She's inside, she's about to go outside, and this shot, when we look at the waveform, is everything is way, way dark, but it's not, pure black. We've got the illusion of detail in here, maybe because we're not at pure black. We've got some of that dark, dark gray, and we've got all this interior that's lower, and even out the window we can still see what's out there, and it is significantly brighter than what's going on inside, but it's not blown out. I think this shot would kind of be ruined if these were pure white, just like where you couldn't see anything out the window. And if that were the case, what you may be tempted to do is bring the interior level just way up, and so the window, you just lose it, and everything in here is much more evenly exposed. But I think that really hurts the drama and kind of the cinematic quality of a shot like this. So whenever possible, if you can grade down or shoot probably shoot overexposed, grade down. I would probably say don't shoot underexposed, but you may have to if it's a situation like this with highlights. But just really think, do you want it over or underexposed in the final look? What are you going for? What mood and what tone are you setting? Because something like this definitely speaks a certain way compared to this shot, but 2 stops brighter. Here we have a good example of that, camera side, near side key light, where the front of his face, the side that's closest to the camera, is the side where the key light is coming from, and this is a lot flatter, a lot less interesting, doesn't have that cinematic quality, that drama that we're talking about. Still has the longer focal length, so we got the nice background blur, and we're focused here on him, and the exposure is good, but the lighting just is not as interesting. And for me, this shot looks more stock, it looks more standard than something like this, which has a lot more of that drama to it. Next up, we've got Kendall back again, kind of your typical main talent shot, I guess. If we're looking at our waveforms, we've got her in this area, definitely the brightest part of the image here. We still have some of that moodiness going on with the shadows, but she's very bright, which I do like how this looks. But the thing I wanted to point out here is the lighting, the flat soft lighting is playing a huge role in making this shot look good. Also, the focal length, composition looks nice. We're shooting above her eyes, kind of down, very flattering and slimming. She doesn't necessarily need it, but that's a trick you can definitely use if you're filming somebody who may be a little bit more self-conscious about their weight, their size. Getting the camera above their eye level, shooting down, kind of helps slim them out. It's kind of that MySpace, Facebook, Instagram effect. But what else is really a factor here is the amount of makeup that she has on. If you are shooting regular people without makeup, it will not look like this. You can't do it. Makeup plays such a huge role, and I think that a lot of times camera people, independent filmmakers, they lose sight. They think it's all about the gear, but a good portion of it is down to makeup and having a good makeup artist. Plus, I'm sure they're doing some retouching here in software, just really like smoothing out her skin and making her look absolutely flawless. Granted, some of that could be down to compression due to the YouTube encoding, but really, if you're expecting to get this level of kind of commercial quality, got to have the lighting right, got to have definitely a good camera that can capture the dynamic range, but also having a makeup artist and a good post-production touch-up artist will also help tremendously. Here is another shot illustrating the focal length, where we've got kind of this typical over-the-shoulder look, and we don't really know who's in the foreground here, but we can tell that it's a person, and she's looking at this person, and the next shot, oh, it's him. They're looking at each other, and she's in the foreground here. But there's really not much detail in the foreground other than maybe some color that's telling you who is who, but it still works and it still looks really nice. This is a lot better doing it with a longer focal length, just compressing it and kind of blurring it, than if you were to shoot this same shot with a wide angle lens, because you'd have so much detail, and he would be so much bigger than her in the foreground with a wide angle lens that it just would not look very nice. I typically try to avoid doing over the shoulder shots with wide angle lenses because it just never ever looks good. Over the shoulder looks its best when you're shooting with those longer focal lengths. Again, here we're using that longer focal length. We've got quite a few subjects, but we're getting a lot of compression. So even though this gentleman is closest to the camera, he's only moderately bigger in frame than these other guys. They're all, within reason, about the same size. You could do this shot with a wide angle lens, but it's just not going to look like this. And from my perspective, it's not going to look as good. Same thing here. She's walking through the crowd. We got this kind of medium, but we've got a lot of, we're kind of compressing everyone so they're all relatively the same size, shooting through it. So we got foreground action, we got background action, we got a lot of layers to the image, which makes it a lot more interesting than maybe if we just filmed her straight on or some other angle. I don't even think they never show her from behind. Now that I'm thinking about it in this ad, they never follow her. It's always showing her face, which is another thing you probably want to do. Unless you have a reason, maybe it's a suspense or a tension aspect, which it can be helpful to follow a character from behind because you don't necessarily see what their face is doing. It does create a sense of dread and suspense. So for like a horror film, that's usually pretty helpful. But in general, you almost always want your camera seeing faces in front of it because that makes it feel a lot more lively. It feels open. It feels safe. These are all kind of those subtle subconscious things that are communicated to an audience that where you put the camera does matter, and it will make an impact on how people perceive the project you're working on. Here we go again from the front. Wide shot, what some people might consider a wide shot, but we're doing a longer focal length. So we're not using those wide angle lenses, even though we're doing a wider shot. And everything's very soft, very diffused lighting. We do have some maybe standouts maybe in the background where it's a little bit hotter, but in general, everyone is very evenly exposed. Soft, nice lighting. Always looks really, really nice, especially for commercial work. And here we get another example where we've got a medium shot of the waist to head shot of a person, longer focal length. So we got foreground action, background action, compressing the image, making it look its best. Same thing here, tons of people, longer focal length. And same thing here, a lot of people, a lot of stuff going on, but we got that longer focal length. So throughout this entire ad, they're using these longer focal lengths to get their wides, mediums, and close-ups. And even though you're not seeing all the detail, because a lot of it's just blurred out, and we don't care who this person is. We don't care who this person is. We care who this person is. So shooting with those longer focal lengths definitely helps show that there's people there, but we want to focus here on our main character. And again, one last shot to wrap it out where we've got all these people, but still doing a longer focal length. That's kind of the takeaway from this. I made a video talking about it before. One quick easy tip is just to shoot with a longer focal length. I wanted to show in practice an actual example that I didn't work on this. I can't take credit for it, but I do really like the way this looks because we're not using so many wide angle lenses. The lighting is pretty straightforward. Most people will say do big soft diffuse light, but I'm a huge fan of that far side lighting where we get that wrap, get that edge. Hopefully that made sense in this. I've talked about it a bunch before, but I think this illustrated it really well. And then also just kind of grading everything down, getting your exposure values in the lower quadrant. This is probably a bad example because of these bright white t-shirt and stuff, but even that, like, nothing's really up there. The only thing, and this is actually really helpful too, because if you need to put text on screen, most of the time it needs to be white, or it looks good if it's white. But white on an overexposed or even an evenly exposed image is going to be it's going to clash a little bit. It's not going to stand out and pop. The reason this white pops is because you can see it's the only stuff up here at 100%. Each of these is one of those letters, and even like this white on his t-shirt is, we got down in this area. So keep that in mind. If you go with this kind of look, you can put text on screen that's white and it'll still stand out. And you can, this can be a grading thing. You can even, with curves, you can even drop your highlights a little bit. It's not the best if stuff's blown out, but if you don't have anything overexposed and clipping, you can even pull your whites down a little bit just to give them that more like milkier gray look. Same thing with your blacks. You can raise them up a little bit, give them that milkier gray look, which looks really nice. We don't want to go for like a log look as the final grade, even though there's some people who do that and think that's really kind of popular. We want some color, we want some contrast, but doing too much, having stuff blown out or clipping or just overexposed in general tends to look more like video. So hopefully that was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions. Happy to answer them in the comments down below.